Juliette, please take the floor.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me like this? I prefer standing. Yeah? Welcome everyone to our presentation and panel discussion on nature-based solutions for water and peace. Today I'll start you guys off with a landscape scale perspective of this notion, this problem, but also this solution. So I don't think I need to go extensively through what it means to have a changing climate. Freshwater distribution is changing. We have biodiversity loss. Need not mention the latest IPCC report. We have natural resources that are depleting. And what is interesting in all of these issues of a changing climate is that it often has to do with a changing water cycle. And that's what we're going to touch upon today. And this natural instability causes social instability because it disrupts the natural functioning of a society. And it causes an increase in vulnerability to crises, mass migration, forced relocation of natives. And Laura will touch upon these social issues more extensively after I finish my presentation. But for now, we are obviously not here to only focus on the problems. I think we've done enough of that. But we are also here today to find new pathways, to find ways to meet the needs of future world populations in the backdrop of a changing climate and a natural resource depletion. And luckily, we're not starting from scratch. I think we're seeing good developments, carbon neutrality in the energy sector. We're seeing changes in mindset, activism, relationships between social and environmental issues. They're completely intertwined. And so we're really not starting from scratch. However, I think if we use our thinking of carbon math only, we might just miss the spot in really meeting all of the needs of future world populations, including clean air, good soil, and to support the biodiversity necessary to feed humans for human health, food production. So that brings me to the point of land use change, which touches upon all of these issues and actually controls the water, the energy, and the carbon cycle. And for this, I'd like to take a pretty big step back to a time that seems ancient and distant to many of us. But we have to remember that humans have altered landscapes for thousands of years, and that's not something new, and it's still impacting us today. And it actually started 2.8 million years ago when we arrived at this earth. And up to now, but also more specifically since the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, when we really started changing landscapes, to the point which now 75 to 95% of our earth is directly altered by our use of land through agriculture, through mining, deforestation. And in all of these interventions with the landscape, we've mostly altered our biosphere, so our vegetation coverage. And this is an important point because altering the vegetation, the terrestrial biosphere, has a direct impact on our atmosphere. And not to give you a small science lesson, but I think it's good for our perspective. So let's see these two environments and to note that the biosphere plays a critical role in the energy partitioning at the surface. So not only energy partitioning actually, but actually the transport of moisture from Earth to atmosphere. Say this left side is a dry environment, no vegetation. On the right, you have a cool, wet environment with a lot of vegetation. If solar energy hits both of these environments, 60 to 70% of this energy on the left side is used or is converted to sensible heat, which is an increase in temperature. On the right side, actually 70 to 80% of this energy is used for latent heat, so for evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and eventually rainfall. So looking at this from a landscape scale, 70% of global land evaporation rains down over land. So we should not take the rain for granted. Vegetation actually makes the rain. And this challenges the traditional notion that areas like the Congo or the Amazon are receive a lot of rainfall because they are specifically at a location that receives a lot of precipitation. But if the vegetation actually makes the rain, you can imagine that changes your perspective. Again, we should not take the rain for granted. And same, we can look at our degraded landscapes, our damaged landscapes these days, and we can imagine in how far have we shaped these. Because even a small disruption of a landscape, changing vegetation or a thriving forest to, for example, agriculture, can trigger a regime shift, can change a regime from a wet regime where it's gaining moisture to a dry regime. So, to put it in one sentence, the state of the biosphere plays an important role in how fresh water is distributed over the globe. And we in turn shape the biosphere. And I'd say this thought is simple and it's confronting, but it's also empowering. Because just as deforestation can trigger a regime shift to a dry regime, large-scale afforestation can do the opposite. Take, for example, the Loess Plateau, which John has a lot to say about. He was the man who documented this project. Started in 1999, and recent research actually from this year shows that this project actually increased the rainfall over 20% within a period of 20 years. And unfortunately, the same is happening, for example, or the opposite is happening actually in the Amazon, where it's said to be reaching a trigger point, or a tipping point actually, to a dry regime. Or in Spain, where in the east coast, the loss of vegetation is actually coupled to the loss in summer storms. Now, looking at our today's landscapes in this lens, take for example the Sinai Desert in Egypt, where the remnants of a lush river system actually show through the arid landscape today. It almost looks like a beating heart. And Egypt now being in the grips of a water crisis, much like any area around the Middle East, they are in dire of need of a sustainable water source, and in actual fact, our only sustainable water source is precipitation. If we look at it like this from a cross-section, what if you have the landscape that it is today, which I'm not sure everybody's background, but a simple meteorological lesson of the sea breeze. If the land heats up, it pulls in moisture from the Mediterranean, and that heating of the land, if there's no additional moisture added through a vegetation, this moist air mass actually moves over the mountain. No condensation occurs and no precipitation happens. What if you revegetate this region, taking into account all ecological intricacies that exist? So considering the lagoon, considering the wetlands, the grasslands, the trees, everything going from the coast inland, what if we can restore this? What if we can restore the full water cycle by adding enough moisture, leading to precipitation and eventually a totally restored water cycle? And the interesting is that for as long as we have existed here, we have been altering our landscapes, we have been changing our biosphere, and unfortunately the main driver has been economic growth. So economic growth has been the primary driver behind land transformation. Our extraction and consumption culture has led to a point where we should rethink why we are changing landscapes, because it's not serving us in the way we might have thought it would in the beginning. So what if water cycle restoration and the restoration of ecological functioning can become the primary driving force behind land transformation? Because in fact, there is nothing more valuable than a good ecological functioning earth. That's what we're fully reliant on as human beings. So, to summarize this aspect, landscape scale nature-based solutions, to put it in the jargon terms we love to use, as a strategy for water cycle restoration. And the question then is, where and how should we distribute our energy and water resources to produce regenerative ecosystems? Because it is not as if placing any trees anywhere will lead to a positive water yield. So we have to rethink how we do it, and also be informed on how we afforestate, and be informed on whether the productivity of an arid region can actually be restored or whether it cannot. So who plays a role? That's also a huge question we have to answer. And the simple answer to how and who is we have to take it step by step, and we need everybody. We need indigenous to co-create with industry. We need to change our economic system that actually values ecological functioning. That's the only way ahead. And we need to interdisciplinary find ways, working with academics, ecologists, engineers, scientists from every aspect to work together to find solutions. So to summarize the criteria of a nature-based solution that would lead to the maximum outcome on a holistic level, on a social level, but also on a physical level. First is to take a proactive, adaptive approach. And by this I mean, I think a term we've seen these days also is learn by doing. I liked, what was it, flying a plane and building it on your way, something like that. But to make this maybe more specifically on the topic, it's not as if you don't do the research ahead. You do the research, but you optimize while working. And you construct rapid feedback loops between implementation and observation. So have an extensive monitoring scheme. And as I mentioned, rigorous interdisciplinary scientific planning, merging ecology and atmospheric science is necessary. These projects must be data-driven. We have to use the technology, and I have no doubt about the level of our techniques, technology, geospatial data. We have enough information. And it has to happen at landscape scale. At some point, it has to go from local to regional to global impact. The scale has to be big enough. And this pun is intended. We have to move mountains, quite literally, so we need the industry support. And the most important point, I'd say, is that it has to be grounded in indigenous knowledge. And it's not to say we have a global strategy and to take them along, but people on the ground have to be connected to the global strategy, and we have to move from two directions. We can't go top down, we can't go only bottom up, we have to go from two directions. And it has to be supported by blended finance and governance structures. We have to create new win-win situations for public and private in the short, medium, and long term. And this one I haven't written down, but we actually need a shared vision. Just as we had a vision to land on the moon, we have a shared vision to restore this Earth. Thank you.